There is a river that no longer exists. It ran for over 40 miles through the Egyptian desert, half a mile wide, deep enough to swallow an 8-story building. And every single one of the Great Pyramids was built along its banks. You cannot see it today. It is gone. Buried under sand and farmland, erased so completely that for 4,500 years, no one knew it was there. But in 2024, a machine looking down from space found its ghost still pressed into the ground. And the moment it appeared on the screen, one of the oldest questions in human history quietly changed its answer. Because for as long as anyone has asked why the pyramids stand exactly where they stand, the honest answer has been that nobody knew. They rise out of one narrow strip of desert on the west bank of the Nile, dozens of them lined up like beads on a string, in a place that looks like the middle of nowhere. And now we know it was not nowhere. It was a waterfront. The pyramids were not built in a desert. They were built on a shoreline that has since vanished from the face of the earth. That single fact cracks open something much larger. Because if the location was chosen for the water, then the story we were told, that these are simply tombs, glorified graves for dead kings, starts to look incomplete. The deeper modern instruments look, the more the pyramids stop behaving like tombs and start behaving like something else. Something with a purpose we are only now able to measure. And the vanished river is just the first piece. Because once you understand why the pyramids stand where they stand, 3 more things fall into place, and each one is stranger than the last. There is a document, the oldest of its kind on Earth, written by a man who watched the Great Pyramid being finished with his own eyes, and it does not describe what you think it describes. There is a lost city stumbled upon by accident that rewrites who these builders actually were. And there is an idea quietly gaining ground among serious researchers about what the pyramids were really meant to produce. That has nothing to do with death at all. Today, we are going to go through all of it, in order, and by the end, the pyramids will not look like graves to you anymore. Stay with me, because the part everyone argues about is not the part that should change how you see them. Most people who visit Giza never think about the ground. They photograph the 3 great shapes. They ride a camel, they leave. They stand on what looks like permanent, timeless desert, and assume it always looked this way. Most people walk right past the real mystery without ever knowing it's there. Because the strangest thing about the pyramids is not how they were built. It is where they were built and what used to be there and what that tells us they were actually for. Let's start with what is not in dispute. The largest pyramid on the Giza plateau was built for a pharaoh named Khufu, who ruled Egypt during the 4th dynasty. It was completed around 2560 BCE, which makes it roughly 4,500 years old. It stood about 480 feet tall when finished, and it stayed the tallest structure human beings had ever made for nearly 4,000 years. Not the tallest in Egypt, the tallest on the entire planet. Nothing anywhere came close until the great cathedrals of medieval Europe. And even then, only barely. And here is the first thing that should make you uncomfortable. A civilization with no iron tools, no pulleys as we understand them, no wheels built for this kind of load, somehow moved more than 2 million blocks of stone, some weighing as much as 80 tons, and stacked them into a structure so precise its base is level to within a couple of centimeters across an area larger than 9 football fields. Its 4 sides aligned to true north to within a fraction of a degree. We still cannot fully explain how they did it. That is not a fringe claim. That is the mainstream position. The people who have spent their entire lives studying this monument will tell you plainly that the how remains, in key ways, unsolved. But how was never the deepest question. Why is? Why here? Why like this? Why pour the wealth of an entire kingdom into a mountain of stone for one man's burial, and then leave that burial strangely, conspicuously empty? Because when the first people broke into the upper chambers of the Great Pyramid, They found no king. The granite coffer in the king's chamber was empty. No body, no mummy, no treasure, no gold, and no inscription naming Khufu anywhere on the walls of the room that was supposedly built to hold him for eternity. For a culture that covered its tombs in text and spells and painted images to guide the dead through the afterlife, the walls of the grandest tomb ever built are completely bare, silent, a blank room at the heart of the most decorated civilization in the ancient world. The standard answer is robbers. And robbers did get in over the centuries. But look closely at what that explanation asks you to believe. Robbers take gold. They take jewelry and amulets, and anything they can carry and sell. They do not usually take the several-ton stone lid of the coffer. They do not take the body itself. They do not scrub every last trace that a burial ever happened, then leave the ceiling plug stones that should have blocked the passage strangely undisturbed. The Great Pyramid does not read like a looted tomb. It reads like a room that may never have held a body at all. And that does not tell us what it was for. It just tells us, one more time, that the simple story has holes in it. It always has. And that is exactly why the ground underneath these monuments, the vanished river, and the buried city, and the diary of a working man, matters so much. If the answer is not inside the tomb, maybe it was never supposed to be. Maybe the answer is in everything around it. For most of the last century, we studied the pyramids by looking at the pyramids, the stone, the chambers, the angles. We treated them as objects sitting on a blank stage. What almost nobody did was ask what the stage itself used to look like 4,500 years ago, because the landscape had changed so completely that the original setting seemed lost forever. The Nile today runs several miles to the east. The land around Giza is dry plateau and irrigated field. There was no obvious water, and without water, the entire logic of the place stayed hidden. Then, physics and satellites handed us a key. It started with a single expert eye. Imam Ghanem, a geomorphologist at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, grew up in Egypt and had spent her whole life wondering why the pyramids clustered where they did. Studying multispectral satellite images of the region, wavelengths of light the human eye cannot see, she noticed a faint, unmistakable trace pressed into the landscape. The signature of an old riverbank, running for miles, hiding in plain sight beneath desert and farmland. She applied for funding to dig deeper. And in 2024, her team published the result in the journal Communications, Earth and Environment. They had used radar satellite imagery, the kind that can penetrate the sand surface, combined with ground-penetrating radar, electromagnetic tomography, and deep soil cores drilled straight down into the earth. And what they mapped stopped the field cold, running along the foot of the western desert plateau, right past the pyramid fields, was the buried channel of a long-dead branch of the Nile. They named it the Ahramat Branch, from the Arabic word for pyramids. It stretched about 40 miles from Giza south toward the town of Lisht, near where more than 30 pyramids stand. In its day, it was around half a kilometer wide and at least 25 meters deep, a serious river, comparable in scale to the Nile that flows through Cairo today. And to prove it was real, and not just a shadow on a screen, the team drilled 2 long cores of earth, pulled from about 25 meters down, came back full of the clean, sandy sediment that only a flowing river channel leaves behind. Not a theory, not a guess. A dead river, confirmed from space and from the ground, sleeping under the desert exactly where the pyramids line up. Sit with what that means. More than 30 pyramids, scattered across different reigns and centuries, are strung along the banks of this vanished waterway, like ports along a coast. The causeways, those long stone ramps leading up to each pyramid, run down toward it. The valley temples at the ends of those causeways, structures Egyptologists had always found slightly puzzling, suddenly make sense. They were harbors, docks. The pyramids were not marooned in the desert. They were riverfront developments, and the river is what chose their location. If you find buried history as unsettling as I do, subscribe and turn on the bell, because what the water reveals about the true purpose of these monuments is the part they never put on the tour. So now the question sharpens. If the pyramids were built on a river, what was the river for? And this is where the second piece of evidence enters, and it is not carved in stone. It is written on paper, the oldest inscribed papyri ever found in Egypt. In 2013, a French and Egyptian team led by archaeologist Pierre Tallet was excavating a remote harbor on the Red Sea coast called Wadi al-Jarf. Buried in front of a set of man-made storage caves, sealed between two large blocks of stone, they found hundreds of fragments of papyrus. When they translated them, they realized they were holding something no one had ever seen: a logbook. A day-by-day work diary kept by a middle-ranking inspector named Merer, written in the 27th year of the reign of Khufu, at the exact moment the Great Pyramid was being finished. This is the oldest written eyewitness account of the pyramid's construction in existence. It was written by a man who was there. And what does Merer write about? Not gods, not magic, not mystery. Logistics. Merer commanded a team of around 40 men, part of a larger crew, and their job was to move stone. Specifically, they hauled fine white limestone from the quarries at Tura, on the opposite bank of the Nile, to the construction site at Giza, the place the papyri call Akhet Khufu, the horizon of Khufu. And they did it by boat. Load the blocks, sail them down the river, and through a system of canals. Unload, repeat. A round trip took 2 to 3 days. The diary records it in a plain 2-column daily timetable, like a shipping manifest. Not a myth, not a metaphor. A schedule. Read Merer's diary next to Ghonem's buried river, and the two lock together like a key in a lock. The papyrus describes moving stone by water directly to the foot of the pyramid. The satellite radar shows the water that made it possible, right where the diary says it should be. One is a document written 4,500 years ago. The other is a geological scan from 2024. They were produced 45 centuries apart by people who could never have coordinated, and they describe the same thing. Not similar things, the same thing. The river in the papyrus is the river under the sand. And Merer's logbook mentions one more detail that turns out to matter enormously. It refers again and again to a place called Roshi Khufu, which translates roughly as the entrance to the pool or basin of Khufu. A pool, an artificial harbor, a managed body of water built at the base of the pyramid to receive the boats. This was Merer's home base, the hub his crew kept returning to between runs. The Egyptians were not just using a river that happened to be there. They were engineering the water, building basins, cutting canals, damming and redirecting the annual flood to float multi-ton blocks right up to the edge of the construction site. And the timing in the diary proves it. The heavy stone deliveries happen after the flood arrives, when the water rises high enough to carry loaded boats close to the plateau. They scheduled the hardest part of the work, around the rhythm of the river. They read the Nile like an engineer reads a blueprint. That is not the behavior of people building a simple grave. That is the behavior of a state running the largest logistics operation in the ancient world. And it reframes the entire question of what the pyramids were for. Because a grave does not need a harbor. A grave does not need a shipping schedule, a fleet, a network of canals, and a workforce timed to the flood. A national project does. Every detail Merer records points away from the lonely tomb and towards something enormous and coordinated and alive. A whole country bending its rivers and its seasons, and its people around a single point in the desert. The pyramid was the point, but the machinery around it was the real story. Here's where it gets strange, and this is the clue that turns a construction story into something bigger. For centuries, the image most people carried was slaves. Whipped, starving masses dragging stone under the lash, an idea planted by the Greek historian Herodotus almost 2,000 years after the fact, and burned into everyone's mind by Hollywood. It is one of the most durable pictures in all of history, and modern archaeology has demolished it. In 1990, a tourist riding near the Giza plateau was thrown when her horse tripped over a low mud brick wall buried in the sand. That wall turned out to be part of a tomb, and that tomb was part of an entire lost settlement. Excavations led by Mark Lehner and Zahi Hawass uncovered a purpose-built town at the foot of the plateau, a workers' city that once housed thousands of people. And everything in it contradicts the slave story. They found bakeries by the dozen, breweries, evidence that the administration was shipping in something like 4,000 pounds of meat a day, cattle and sheep and goats driven in from the Nile Delta to feed the crews. Analysis of 175,000 animal bone fragments showed these laborers ate beef regularly, a luxury even many nobles didn't enjoy daily. They received medical care. Skeletons show healed fractures, set bones, even signs of surgery survived. And when workers died on the job, they were not dumped. They were buried with honor, with jars of bread and beer for the afterlife, in their own tombs, in the shadow of the very pyramids they raised. Slaves are not fed like that. Slaves are not given surgery and honored burials in the shadow of the king's own monument. These were organized crews, some permanent skilled craftsmen and masons who stayed on for years, some rotating teams of ordinary Egyptians who came and went with the seasons. They worked in named gangs, and the names survived, some of them scrawled in red ochre paint on the stones inside the pyramid itself, right above the king's chamber, alongside tally marks counting the days worked. One gang called themselves the Friends of Khufu. Another, at a different pyramid, the Drunkards of Menkaure. You do not paint yourself the friend of the king you are enslaved by. You do not tally your workdays with pride under the lash. These people were, in some real and measurable sense, invested in the work. Herodotus was wrong. Hollywood was wrong. The picture in almost everyone's head is wrong. And that single correction opens the door to the most quietly radical idea in modern Egyptology, the one that finally answers the question of what the pyramids were truly for. That's the second clue. The third is the one that reframes everything. And it comes not from a shovel, but from an argument about what a project like this does to a society. Think about what building the Great Pyramid actually required. Not just stone and rope. It required feeding and housing and organizing tens of thousands of people year after year for decades. It required a nationwide supply chain. Granite from Aswan, 500 miles to the south, fine limestone from Tura across the river, copper from the Sinai, food from the fertile delta in the north, timber, rope, pottery, bread, beer, all of it flowing to one point in the desert along that now vanished river. To pull that off, a young kingdom had to invent something it had never needed before: administration. Writing systems for tracking goods, a calendar for scheduling labor around the flood, ranks of scribes and inspectors like Merer, ways to move, feed, pay, and coordinate a workforce larger than most cities of the age. The pyramid did not just require a state. The pyramid may have built the state. This is the reframing that a growing number of researchers now take seriously. That the deepest purpose of the pyramids was never only the tomb at all. The tomb was the reason on paper, the sacred justification that made the whole thing possible. But the true engine, the thing the project actually produced, was a unified nation. A machine for turning scattered farming villages along the Nile into a single, coordinated civilization with a shared identity, a shared calendar, a shared administration, and a shared staggering achievement they could all point to. Consider what the alternative looked like. Before the Great Pyramids, Egypt was a young thing, a strip of settlements stitched loosely together along 1,000 miles of river, only recently unified under a single crown. Holding that together was not guaranteed. Kingdoms in that era came apart as easily as they came together. And then, for the span of a few generations, the entire country pours itself into one shared task. Farmers who would otherwise never leave their village travel to Giza during the flood season, when the fields are underwater and there is no farming to do anyway. They join a crew. They are fed better than they have ever been fed. They learn to work alongside people from the far end of the kingdom, under a chain of command, toward a goal they can see rising higher into the sky every year. And when the flood recedes, they go home, carrying the story with them. Multiply that by decades and tens of thousands of people, and you are not just building a monument, you are manufacturing a people. You are teaching an entire population, in the most memorable way imaginable, that they are one thing, one kingdom, one Egypt. The pyramid was a nation-building program disguised as a grave. The largest public works project of the ancient world, and its most important output was not the monument. It was Egypt itself. The stone was almost a byproduct. The real construction was the civilization that had to exist in order to raise it. For decades, scholars dismissed the social side of pyramid building as a side effect, secondary to the religious purpose. But the more we learn, the harder that ranking is to defend. When you have a workforce that names itself after the king with pride, a supply chain that reorganized an entire river valley, and a monument whose construction demanded the invention of the state, at some point, you have to ask which was the means and which was the end. Was the nation built to make the tomb, or was the tomb the pretext to build the nation? The Egyptians left us no manual that answers it. They just left the pyramid, and the vanished river, and the diary of a man named Merer, and a workers' city full of beef bones and honored graves. Now, here is where the story takes on the texture of every great unsolved mystery, because the deeper you go, the more the ground refuses to give up its secrets. That buried river, the Ahramat Branch, did not simply dry up on a schedule to suit the pharaohs. The research suggests it slowly died over centuries, pushed east by shifting ground, choked by wind-blown sand, and starved by a drying climate as the Nile's floods weakened after the Fourth Dynasty. And that timeline matters because it may explain something no one could explain before: why the greatest pyramids were built when they were, and never again. The peak of pyramid building lines up with the peak of that river's flow. As the water receded, so did the age of the giants. The civilization that the pyramids helped forge outlived the very waterway that made them possible. The river gave Egypt the pyramids, and then the river vanished, taking the secret of the location with it into the sand for 4,500 years. And so much of what lies beneath is still sealed. The soil cores tell us the river was there, but its full course, its harbors, the basins Merer wrote about, most of it is still buried under modern farmland and the streets of Greater Cairo, unexcavated, waiting. Researchers openly say there may be countless temples and structures still down there, entombed under the fields, that we have simply never been able to reach. The map we have is a 40-mile sketch of something far larger. The story is not finished. It is barely begun. We found the ghost of the river. We have not yet walked its banks. Now, does any of this prove the most extreme version of the story? That the pyramids were power plants or ancient machines, or beacons built to signal the stars? Recently, a non-peer-reviewed paper even argued the Great Pyramid's precise latitude encodes the speed of light, and that it functioned as some kind of planetary transmitter. Let's be honest, because the truth here deserves better than hype. Probably not. That kind of claim leans on coincidences of numbers that fall apart the moment you look at how many ways there are to measure a building and pick the ones that match. The mainstream has real weight behind it. The pyramids really were tombs, or at least were meant to be. Khufu really was a king who wanted to be buried like a god. The religion was real, and it mattered. But strip away every wild theory, the transmitters and the aliens and the lost super technology, and you are left with a set of plain facts that are arguably stranger than the fantasy. A dead river, half a mile wide, hidden under the desert for 45 centuries until a satellite found its shadow. A 4,500-year-old work diary, the oldest writing ever found in Egypt, describing boats hauling stone to a pyramid across water that no longer exists. A lost city of thousands of well-fed, well-paid, honored workers who named their crews after the king. And a monument so precise, so massive, so far beyond what its age should have been capable of, that building it may have required inventing civilization itself to get it done. You do not need aliens to be unsettled by that. You just need to look at what is actually there. And if even the grounded version of this is true, it means something uncomfortable about the story we told ourselves. It means the pyramids were not the strange obsession of a death cult king. They were the birth certificate of a nation. It means the greatest monuments of the ancient world were also its greatest social experiment. And it worked so well that the country it created lasted 3,000 years. It means that for most of modern history, we stood in front of the most studied structure on Earth and misread its purpose, because we were looking at the stone instead of the ground it stood on, and the people who moved it. Our picture of the ancient world is not a finished portrait. It is a sketch with a river erased from the middle of it. And now the erased parts are coming back. Radar that sees through sand, muon particles from deep space that map hidden voids inside solid rock, soil cores that read the memory of a vanished flood, satellite eyes that catch the ghost of a riverbank no human has seen in 4,500 years. Every year, the tools get sharper, and every year, the pyramids give up a little more of what they were hiding. And every time they do, they get more complicated, not less. We thought they were graves. We are learning they were engines. Engines for moving stone, yes, but also engines for building something that could not be quarried or carried. A shared identity strong enough to hold a civilization together for 3,000 years. And we still do not know how much of the story is still down there, sealed under the farms and the sand, in the harbors and basins and temples strung along a river that dried up before the first word of recorded history was written. The soil cores prove the water was real. Almost everything the water touched is still buried. Here is the one question that won't let go. If the true purpose of the pyramids was never really the tomb, if the empty chamber was always just the reason written on the surface, while the real work was happening in the fields and the harbors and the workshops of an entire awakening nation, then what were the people who built them actually trying to leave behind? Not a body. The body was never even there. Something larger. And whatever it was, it is still standing on the Giza plateau exactly where the vanished river left it, on a shoreline that no longer exists, holding a purpose we are only now, 4,500 years later, beginning to read. It was built to last. It has outlasted the very river that made it. And the deepest answer to why it is there is still buried in the ground beneath your feet, waiting for someone to dig it out.